Tweeting. It is my very, tweet whatever you like, I'm sure it'll be complimentary. It is my very great honour and privilege now to introduce Professor Angela Davis. I feel like saying I don't need to because you gave her such a warm welcome as she walked in. But just a few words. Angela Davis, of course, well known to all of us as an activist against every form of oppression, a feminist activist, an African-American activist, speaking out for LGBT rights long before they became accepted and mainstream, and of course, a socialist. She describes herself as a living witness to the historical struggles of our contemporary era, and that's absolutely right in a number of ways. One is that she was deeply involved in the protests in the late 60s and early 70s, and was removed from a philosophy teaching post at UCLA in 1969 because of her social activism and because of her membership of the Communist Party. She was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list as a result of false and outrageous charges, and that led her to live underground for some 16 months, I think, and subsequently faced a very political trial from which she was acquitted, and she attributes that acquittal, and this has been a theme of our conference today, not so much to the lawyers and the legal strategy, I'm sure they played something of a role, but principally to a huge, massive Free Angela Davis campaign that was US-wide and indeed was worldwide. And as people who are lawyers, law students, active in the law, one of the big themes of this weekend's conference has been about how legal strategies cannot be divorced from political activism. The governor of California in the 1970s, a chap called Ronald Reagan, vowed that she would never teach in the University of California system again. And I'm very pleased to say that for a number of years she's been Professor Emerita at Santa Cruz University in California. So his vow did not come true. In 1994 she was appointed Presidential Chair in African American and Feminist Studies. That's the stuff that she's, as it were, more well known for because of the history of the left. But she has also been a founding member of a group called Critical Resistance, and details of that are in her biography in your pack. And that's an organisation that's come out of the struggle around prisoners' rights. But importantly, it's dedicated not to prison reform, not to making things better, but to prison abolition. And it campaigns against the phrase in the US is the prison industrial complex, and that stands for the whole relationship in the private sector and in the public sector around the security system, around surveillance, around the police system, and of course the imprisonment and incarceration of so many people, overwhelmingly people of colour, people from poor communities, people from activist communities, and of course people from migrant communities. And Critical Resistance takes the view that you cannot improve such a system, you cannot simply argue, you should not simply argue to make small gains, but that the whole system needs abolishing altogether. The phrase on the Critical Resistance website, and you can look them up, criticalresistance.org, says quite simply, we challenge the belief that caging and controlling people makes us safe. We believe that basic necessities such as food, shelter and freedom are what really make our communities secure. And our work is part of global struggles against inequality and powerlessness. And of course we know that in the US, the prison industrial complex plays that very particular role of oppressing communities. But we're not free from that in the UK either, and we've had our own series of scandals when the police have shot dead black men for the crime of simply being on the streets and so forth. We spent quite a bit of this conference discussing that. Dr. Davis has also had songs written about her. She may be the only person speaking to you at this conference who's had songs written about her, not least by the Rolling Stones, which is something. But the one I like, I'm embarrassed I can't remember the name, I was trying to look it up this morning, but there is an amazing, it's not really a song, rap song by Asian Dub Foundation in which Angela Davis is speaking. So they're not singing about her, she's actually speaking, she's in the song. And what she's speaking about is how she really doesn't want to be an activist. She really would quite like a quiet life. But in the context of... But in the context... I'll send it to you. In the context of experiencing oppression, war, everyday brutality, that she is very clear that she has absolutely no choice but to keep struggling on. And I do recommend it. It's by Asian Dub Foundation. I wish I could remember the name of the song, and I will definitely send it to you, Angela. So that commitment to struggle has been exemplified by all sorts of things, but nonetheless in the fact that she has just got off the plane about 6 hours ago. She's had a brief rest in her hotel room. We are incredibly grateful that she has come straight from the plane to address us at this conference today. She's going to talk for about half an hour, and there then will be a chance for questions. And so please join me in welcoming Angela Davis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Now, I'm not familiar with that song. I'd like to hear myself saying that I prefer a quiet life. But anyway, I'm very happy to be able to participate in this important International Women's Conference organized by the Haldane Society for Socialist Lawyers. And I am especially happy to hear that the theme of the conference has been women fighting back. What I really appreciate is that the Haldane Society has not given up on socialism. Also celebrating the leadership role of women lawyers and activists. Where else would one want to be at this particular juncture of history? So let me thank everyone involved in organizing this conference. And I regret that I haven't been able to participate in the entire conference because I had other obligations. I was not able to leave the U.S. until, well, I think it was yesterday. But it feels more like today because it is quite early in the morning for me now. I think I'm not even supposed to be awake at this point. But let me say that I was here last year to, around the same time, to participate in the memorial service for Stuart Hall. And at that time, the Ferguson protests were ongoing. As a matter of fact, protesters in Ferguson are still active. Along with, I guess you've been reading about or watching the news about the protests in Minneapolis, and San Diego, and Chicago, and many other cities around the U.S. Last year, this time, the names of Mike Brown and Eric Garner were circulating around the world. And many people were wondering whether the upsurge in protest in the U.S. was an indication that that there might be a more radical turn in progressive movements, or whether it was simply a temporary phenomenon, whether it was a temporary moment, or whether the slogan and hashtag Black Lives Matter signify a new direction for Black anti-racist and progressive movements. I do want to dwell on the political leadership. Let me set my time.
I'll time you.
Yeah, but I kind of like to know. Here we go. Because, you know, I hate it when speakers go on and on and on. They're so involved in what they're saying, and they have absolutely no idea that they've been speaking for an hour and a half. So as I was saying, I do want to dwell on women's leadership, political leadership of these new struggles more extensively. But now I want to emphasize the fact that this new wave of protests and the new movements with which they are associated are not only largely led by women, but the women in leadership have insisted on new forms of leadership that do not highlight single individuals. Instead of the traditional masculinist, charismatic forms of leadership, they have insisted on collective leadership. These movements have been often criticized as leaderless because there doesn't appear to be an emergent Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X. But they have responded by saying that they are not leaderless, rather they are leaderful. Leaderful, not leaderless. I assume that you've been following developments in the U.S., and I should point out that I don't want to privilege the U.S. as the most important site of progressive activism. As a matter of fact, given the xenophobic response to refugees from Africa and the Middle East here in Europe, and given the rise of Islamophobia in connection to what is frequently evoked as the war on terror, which is far from the most productive way to address tragedies such as what recently happened in Paris. It is critically important, I think, to highlight the development of potentially transformative anti-racist movements in Europe. But I'm speaking about the U.S. because that is where I live and work. And that is the part of the world with which I am most familiar. But I am aware that movements everywhere, especially in the U.S., urgently need to acknowledge the importance of internationalism. And that is why I was very happy to learn that this was a conference with a very important international dimension. In the U.S., I should say, nearly every week, and sometimes every day, we hear about a new case or new developments and old cases of state violence inflicted by the police on Black people. And there are some who may be under the mistaken impression that police are now more likely to engage in more repressive behavior. But of course, most of us recognize it, most of us involved in progressive radical movements recognize that these attacks have been happening continuously. Continuously, in fact, since the 19th century and the aftermath of slavery. All of us who have been activists for as long as I've been involved very, very long time. Can point to similar cases of police violence and vigilante lynchings from the Emmett Till case in 1951. There was also the notorious kissing case from North Carolina, and people in Europe and other parts of the world responded to that and were able to prevent the incarceration of this 9-year-old black boy who could simply kiss. No, as a matter of fact, I think it was the white girl, the little white girl, who would kiss the black boy while they were playing, and he ended up being charged with rape and molestation. We have learned recently more contemporary names like Trayvon Martin in 2012, Mike Brown in Missouri. You remember the Hands Up, Don't Shoot slogan. Eric Garner in New York that produced the I Can't Breathe slogan. 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Ohio. And more recently, we have heard about the case of Laquan McDonald in Chicago. I'm not sure whether you've seen that horrendous video of this young man who was supposedly high on some kind of drug, who was walking away from the police and was shot 16 times. And it took 400 days for the video to be released. It was released a couple of days ago, and now there are massive protests in Chicago. But I evoke the names of a few men killed by police. We shouldn't assume that state violence exclusively targets young black men or young men of color. Black women and women of color have also had their lives claimed by police violence. And I'll just mention a few names. In Cleveland, there was Tanisha Anderson. In Washington, D.C., Miriam Carey, Rekia Boyd in Chicago, and not long ago, Sandra Bland in Texas. And I have a list of many other names of women here. And what's interesting is that in a number of the cases, the women are mentally or emotionally disordered in some way or another. So it's clear that mental illness, as experienced by a black woman, a woman of African descent, who encounters the police, is often a fatal combination. But I also want to challenge the category of gender and the fact that we generally tend to think in binary terms by pointing out that oftentimes trans people, especially trans women, especially trans women of color who are unable to pass, are the easiest targets. And so there is a long, long list of trans women going back to Venus Extravaganza and more recently Elijah Walker and Tamara Dominguez. Again, I have a long list of names of trans women who have been killed by the police. I was really excited to see the protest. This is Sunday today, right? Yesterday is Saturday. So Black Friday was 2 days ago here. And I was really excited to learn that in Chicago, they had decided to organize a massive protest along the Magnificent Mile, which is the site of luxury consumerism to which people ordinarily would flock on Black Friday. And therefore, the protests have acquired an anti-capitalist dimension. And I want to talk a little bit later about the intersectional character of these struggles against racism. And the way in which many of the strategies that came out of the Occupy movement are being incorporated in the anti-racist struggles today. Now, I see I've been speaking already for about half the time, a lot of me.
We have some flexibility.
Okay. But I'll tell you that I had a section in my notes where I wanted to talk a little bit about progressive lawyers and the important work of progressive lawyers. It may be the case that lawyering alone by itself may not accomplish what we might expect it to. But those lawyers who are aware of the connection of the work that they do with the development of mass movements are doing some of the most important work of our time. And of course, I myself wouldn't be standing here today if it weren't for the work of those lawyers, all of whom recognize the importance of contextualizing their work in relation to the development of mass movements, so that oftentimes legal strategy took into consideration what was happening in the larger organizing sphere. And I wanted to mention Doris Walker, who was a former president of the National Lawyers Guild and a member of the Communist Party at the time, who was on my legal team, as well as Margaret Burnham, who now runs a civil rights and restorative justice project that revives old cold cases in the South, cases of lynchings, of illegal property appropriations, vigilante and police violence. And of course, I can't speak to this audience of progressively. Most of you lawyers? Yeah? Okay, who are the lawyers in the house? Okay, good number of lawyers, right? And I have to acknowledge, even though this is now I just observed the 45th year of the 45th anniversary of my arrest. Is that? No, was it? 1970? Yes, I was arrested in 1970, and I don't remember it. And I think the date passed without me. So it's been 45 years, but I can never forget how important the work of the Haldane Society, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, and I see Jean Mara is here. And I know that I would not be where I am today, and our movements, our anti-prison movements, anti-violence movements would not be where they are without your assistance and solidarity. And I say that recognizing that there are quite a number of generations here. But those of you who are younger are building on the legacies of those who did the work before you. I wanted to mention this city because I remember making several visits to London in the 1970s in the aftermath of my acquittal. And I especially recall a number of visits in connection with the anti-apartheid movement here, including at least 2 or 3 on South African Women's Day. So I want to remember August 9th, as I feel extremely privileged to have personally met a number of women who provided leadership and passion for the anti-apartheid movement. Women like Albertina Sisulu, Fatima Meer, Winnie Mandela, and of course Ruth First. And as you no doubt know, I know the older people here know, but perhaps the younger ones also have a historical memory of 1956, when 20,000 women from all over South Africa marched on Union buildings in the largest demonstration that had been witnessed inside of the country up till that time. They were marching and presenting petitions against the past laws. Lillian Ngoyi and Helen Joseph were 2 of the leaders of this effort by the ANC. Although the Prime Minister refused to accept the many bundles of petitions the women had brought to Pretoria, their presence and their silence, as a matter of fact, they stood in total silence for a half an hour, after which they sang in Nkosi Sikelel' Afrika. That was sufficiently dramatic to radically transform the movement. And as has been pointed out in many histories of the South African movement, this march militated against the propaganda that women were politically immature, that they were uninformed, that women were inferior. And as a matter of fact, out of that march came this slogan, "Now you have touched the women. You have struck a rock. You have dislodged a boulder, and you will be crushed." And I was thinking that this is something that we need to remember. I can remember back in the 70s repeating this over and over again, because it was so powerful and so clearly reflected not only women's struggle around what are often considered to be women's issues, which isn't to say that those issues aren't absolutely important and should be taken up by everyone, but it was an indication of how women have helped to transform the world. And I remember meeting Ruth First here in London, and I have had the opportunity to spend time with her on several occasions. And as you may know, she was the first white woman to be detained under the 90-day detention law, and she has a very moving memoir that is called 117 Days. Which details the experiences that she had over the 117 days that she was held in prison. So I evoke South Africa not only because of its symbolic, historical significance for women, but also because the struggle in South Africa is far from over. University students, women and men alike, are at this very moment passionately involved in efforts to liberate the university from the web of capital. And they see their efforts today in a direct line that goes back to the 1976 student uprisings in Soweto and the 1956 Women's March. As a matter of fact, recently there were weeks of protest throughout South Africa that culminated in a massive demonstration, once again, a massive demonstration at Union buildings in Pretoria that forced authorities to scrap a proposal to increase tuition. And apparently this was the largest student protest since the 1976 Soweto uprising. And it is, of course, ironic that these protests are challenging the very organization, the African National Congress, that led the successful resistance to apartheid. But as Stuart Hall always liked to point out, there are no guarantees. There are no guarantees. A generation after the victory, the ANC was the target of efforts to move toward a free South Africa. So when Jacob Zuma did not appear at the demonstration in Pretoria, and when the demonstrators were subjected to police violence, one of the students said, "Now we know that Zuma is a coward." He was supposed to show up, and they waited and waited for hours, and he didn't. Now we know that Zuma is a coward. We want more now. Not just a 0% increase. We want free education. We want free education. Now, in the US, Black and other progressive students are demanding changes in the system of higher education as well. You may be familiar with what happened recently at the University of Missouri, when students called for the resignation of the president, who had refused to address a whole range of issues and cases surrounding racism on the campus. And interestingly enough, they were able to get the football team to stand with them. And once the football team joined the students, the president resigned in one day. And not only did the president resign, the chancellor of the entire system of the University of Missouri resigned as well. What I find really interesting is the fact that activists are recognizing the intersectional relations among the issues that are driving contemporary activism. They're making connections between racism and patriarchy, transphobia and anti-capitalism, Palestine and Ferguson. In fact, Palestine has become a consistent theme in the work of young Black activists, both in South Africa and in the US. Young activists speak about the US support for Israeli occupation of Palestine, and very specifically about the extent to which members of police departments in the US have been trained by Israel. So this emphasis on connections, on intersectionality, has largely come from feminist influences on current struggles. The feminism I speak of is also anti-capitalist, because we have to recognize that not all feminisms are equal. So I'm speaking about anti-capitalist feminism, a Marxist-inflected feminism, if you will. And so deep connections are acknowledged between anti-capitalism, anti-racism, the struggle against gender violence, gender equality. And I just wanted to give two more examples. And they have to do with the struggle against symbols, the challenge to symbols. Rhodes in South Africa and Woodrow Wilson in the US. The notion of diversity, which I've always recognized to be a corporate strategy. And I know one can have stronger notions of diversity, and that sometimes it's really important to argue for diversity. But diversity can mean difference that doesn't make a difference at all. And in that sense, it has become a perfect corporate strategy, in the sense that that more and more people of color and women are allowed to participate in an apparatus that continues to be as oppressive as it was before the incorporation of people of color and women. And so it seems to me that these new student movements are at least implicitly arguing that we need something that is much stronger than diversity. We need to call for an end to institutional racism, for radical changes, for decolonization. And I wanted to, I know I have 5 minutes, see you soon. And I wanted to connect the campaign against Woodrow Wilson and the Down with Rhodes campaign, which I think has been taken up here as well, with the challenge to the Confederate flag. And to point out that last summer, when we witnessed some horrendous white supremacist church killings in Charleston, South Carolina, it was a young woman by the name of Bree Newsom who decided that she was going to climb up the flagpole and pull down the Confederate flag. I was actually in Ferguson last summer when that happened. And in Ferguson, the activists were emphasizing the fact that black women played a central role in keeping the Ferguson protests going. That, as a matter of fact, queer black women were central to the organizing. And it has been repeatedly pointed out that Black Lives Matter, the hashtag, the organization, was conceived and created by 3 black queer women who have explicitly encouraged the use of anti-capitalist, feminist strategies, and who have been very much involved in incorporating the campaign for justice in Palestine within the work against police violence and in defense of black lives. So I think I'm going to save most of, one point that I did want to make before I close the formal portion of my presentation is that as a result of these important feminist influences, gender violence is recognized as being connected to institutional violence, to state violence. So intimate violence, state violence, institutional violence have to be thought together. So that many are pointing out that the use of state violence to eradicate gender violence often has the effect of reproducing gender violence. So that the movement against gender violence has to challenge its own reliance on criminalization and to discover perhaps a relationship to the abolitionist movement, which calls for the abolition of prisons and policing and the creation of more productive strategies to purge our societies of violence. And then I'll tell you what I was going to talk about, racialized mass incarceration in relation to the profitability of punishment as a central strategy of global capitalism. And this is why it's so important for the movement against gender violence to disassociate itself from the developments, the global developments in relation to the prison industrial complex. And when we challenge these developments, we also recognize that this very simplistic notion of security, which ideologically relies on the notion that all you have to do is lock up the really dangerous people, and the really dangerous people are inevitably black people and people of color, and the rest of the society will be fine. But that is not the case, because public education suffers. All of the institutions that would be necessary in order to prevent this over-reliance on incarceration and policing absolutely suffer. And I wanted to again affirm the connection between the carceral technologies developed by the prison industrial complex and the struggle in the use of those carceral technologies to repress the everyday lives of Palestinians who live on the West Bank and Gaza and inside Israel. And so let me conclude by pointing out that these new feminist influences and activist movements allow us to think more capaciously, allow us to think about the interconnections among these struggles. And we're not suggesting that everybody is required to be involved with every struggle, but rather recognizing that when one is focusing very specifically on housing or healthcare or gender violence or the rights of refugees, which is so important at this particular moment, both in Europe and the US, that we do this against the backdrop of an awareness of the interconnectedness of these issues, and especially the ways in which global capitalism has exacerbated all of the major social problems of our time. Thank you very much.
There are two roving mics, if we can have one on that staircase and the other. And Angela, can you turn off your mic when the question's being asked? Or it doesn't work? Yes. Right. My mic's off.
Good afternoon, Ms. Davis, and good morning also, I guess, for you at this time. My name is Anna Mensa. I run a social enterprise in the UK called Beyond the Classroom, and I do a lot of work with young people and a lot of work with young women. So my first question is, it seems as though you like London to some degree at least. You've been here, you were here last year and you're here now. So my first question is, will you come back and will you meet some of the young people that I work with that I know would benefit so much from what you are sharing today? That's my first question. And my second question is, as a young woman, as a young black woman, as an emerging social leader, what do I need to learn from what you have done? You've kind of alluded today and spoken before about the fact that the struggle is different now and the landscape is different. So I want to know what it is from what you have done in a completely different time that I need to learn and what things I maybe should amend in your opinion.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I seem to be traveling to London ever more frequently. I keep expecting the weather to be better. But certainly, I would be happy to meet with the young people. We can exchange information afterwards. What I want to offer you as advice, my sense is that the most effective leaders and activists actually find their own way. Of course, there's much to be learned, but I don't think there's a formula for being an effective activist or an effective leader. And I'm someone who never and this may be the point, this may be what I was saying in that song. I never had the desire to become a public figure. But I was always, from the time I was very young, passionately involved in social issues, in anti-racist movements. I grew up in the South during the era of segregation, and my mother was an activist, so I didn't really have, very much of I was sort of born into my activism, but it's something I embraced as a passion, and I came to recognize that I had to find my own way. And it seems to me that young people should recognize that whatever they enjoy doing, they can figure out a way to make a difference in the world. The point that I'm making is that you don't have to drop whatever it is you might feel you're passionate about in order to be an effective activist. If you are an artist, use your art. If you are a teacher, use those talents. And I try to convey to people that, as I said, there is no formula, and that as long as you can figure out how to be a part of larger communities of struggle, larger communities of resistance, then I think that you will definitely have an impact on the world. It seems as if you're doing that right now. So I'd like to encourage you to continue to do what you're doing. Thank you. See, I don't have the microphone, so who has the microphone?
The microphone will go to wherever you point.
Well, okay. 1, 2, I saw a person over there, so she's next, and then I saw a person up there, 1, 2, 3.
I'm Agnieszka with the Outlet Society of Social Historians. I was interested in what you were saying about there being different types of feminism, and I'm imagining what you're meaning as opposed to the socialist feminism that we have prevalent in the room today. Is the sort of the Sheryl Sandberg's movements now towards quotas for boards, and which is essentially about willing participation in existing economic, corporate, social structures. So I think my question is, what are your views on that? Are there lines of commonality there? Is it backtracking what the feminism that you fought for? Just be interested in your views.
Well, sometimes it does, and sometimes it. I think that one has to figure out what kinds of alliances might be strategically important at a given moment. But in general, I would say that those feminisms that emphasize movements up upwards movements in the hierarchies of oppression are not feminisms with which I can relate, to which I can relate. But carceral feminism, that's another term, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with it. I talked about the movement against gender violence and the extent to which mainstream, at least in the US, mainstream movements have embraced criminalization as a strategy. The term carceral feminism refers to feminisms that embrace incarceration as a solution. And so I certainly would disassociate myself from carceral feminisms. I've always been of the impression that those feminisms that target those women that are already pretty high up in economic and political hierarchies are, well, I'm not going to tell them they shouldn't be doing what they're doing. But it seems to me that if you're already pretty high up in the hierarchy, it's so easy to leave everyone else behind. Whereas if you target poor women who are racially oppressed, women who are subject to multiple forms of oppression, when they move in an upwards direction, it seems that everyone benefits from that. So that has been the way in which I've always attempted to refine what kind of feminism I embrace. And I've not always been a person who has embraced feminism, because there was a time when I assumed that feminism was inevitably bourgeois feminism. I think that was the term that I used in those days. I think it's a term that we should perhaps use, bring into usage in the 21st century as well. So I would say radical, working class, anti-racist, anti-colonial feminism would be one way to further refine what kind of feminism is the most productive for this moment in history.
Hi, my name is Wafa. I'm from Palestine, based in Gaza. I came for this conference, and I'm really thankful for the Hamilton Society for providing me such opportunity of meeting you and listening to your speech. And very much appreciate actually hearing Gaza twice in your speech. My question from your reading and understanding to the context, to the blockade and the Israeli occupation and the US government support to the Israelis. Do you think that when they will come and we'll have a free Palestine and one state where both nations can live together, what is the gap among our Palestinians' agenda? Is it the absence of the good leaderships? Because the situation is really difficult, it's complicated for women, activists and leaders. We don't find a space in order to fight. We are fighting internally and externally without any support from the politicians. How you see things and what we as women, as activists, can support our new generation. Thank you very much.
Well, as you know, you posed a very, very difficult question. And I can tell you what I find exciting about the struggle in Palestine. Well, first of all, the fact that Palestinians have persevered for decades and decades, and served as a kind of symbol to the world of the possibility of continuing these legacies of struggle. And during my visit to Palestine a number of years ago, I was so impressed with the joy that I saw on the children's faces, despite the horrendous situation there. I was impressed by the emphasis on education and on the fact that in almost every other country where these kinds of struggles are taking place, there is serious illiteracy, whereas in Palestine, the literacy rate is, 95%. And what I also find challenging in an exciting way is the fact that there's also the possibility of imagining liberation outside of the context of a state, of a nation state. I know that the alternatives are always one state or two state solution. But what if we don't impose that kind of national framework, that the framework of nationalism? It might give us some hope for the future that moves beyond the framework of nationalism. And the nation state is a major problem. It arises in relation to capitalism. And so if we are attempting to develop critiques of capitalism that will move us in a progressive direction, we also have to criticize the nation. We also have to try to break out of the kind of nationalistic frameworks within which, and for lawyers, this is really important because you practice law within the context of the state, and so you have to learn both how to use that law, understand it, and at the same time challenge that law, and perhaps also challenge the framework within which that law was produced as well. So I know instead of answering your questions, I'm posing a number of other questions, but that is what I find so exciting about the struggle in Palestine today.
And we have time for one more question. There are a lot of hands. Andrew, do you want to pick or shall I pick?
Well, let's see, there was one hand that was up, I think, yes, the first time.
Just for that. Can we get the mic up? And my apologies to those that we've not been able to call.
Thank you. I'm Angie, I'm a law student. I wanted to say thank you for talking about the interconnectedness of these struggles. And for talking to us in general. What do you see as the next frontier? Where do we go once we've found each other and realised our struggles are interconnected? And I also wanted to ask, what is the place of the environmental movement in relation to these struggles? It's challenging everything that's challenging the very ground on which we walk. Thanks.
Well, I'm very happy that you raised the issue of environmental struggles, particularly at this moment. I understand there's a demonstration happening today here in London, and I looked at the news, and isn't it interesting that the security that putatively protects neighborhoods and cities from terrorism is used to prevent the display of progressive politics. The march in Paris was canceled. And I saw the image of the thousands of shoes that were installed at the Place de la République, indicating that the march should be happening today. I think that environmental struggles, food justice. One of the things that's so interesting about being involved in radical movements is that the more we struggle, the more complicated our consciousness becomes, and the more complicated our analyses have to become. When I think about the fact that 50 years ago, it would have been really difficult for progressive activists to imagine how much energy we need to focus on climate issues and environmental issues. And of course, it makes sense. It's simple. It's even simplistic. What good is it to try to create a world without racism and without patriarchy and homophobia and the planet itself is deteriorating? There will be no space to give expression to whatever victories we might possibly conceive of. So I'm thinking that food justice is also a really important global issue. And feminist approaches to food justice that not only attend to issues of organic products and farmers markets and so forth. There's a huge movement all around the world for that, but also taking into consideration the working conditions and the workers. Unfortunately, there are many proponents of organic consumption that completely ignore the conditions of the workers who make it possible for us to enjoy organic food. And then, there's the issue of capitalist industrial production of animals that creates so much cruelty and torture. So I think that is what we're going to have to deal with. One looks at the extent to which McDonald's and all of these fast food joints are colonizing the planet and the pain they cause to animals, but also the disease they cause for human beings. And what is supposed to nurture our bodies ends up being disease-producing. So there are a whole range of interconnected issues that we'll have to take up. And I think it's important to have a consciousness of these issues. And I often point out when people ask me about food issues, because there are a lot of people who are proselytizers. You may know some of the proselytizing vegans, right? And, that never works. I don't think proselytizing works for anything except maybe religion. Because people have to develop an awareness on their own. They have to come to consciousness. And so what I like to suggest with respect to food issues is that we encourage conscious eating. So you don't say, oh, you should be eating meat, but rather when you eat the meat, you should be aware of how that was produced. And this is what Marx asked us to do in Capital when he asked us to think about the extent to which we imagine commodities only in terms of exchange value, that is to say, what we have paid for them rather than the fact that these commodities are often, they often conceal our relationship to the human beings who produce them. So rather than thinking about the fact that I paid $100 for these pants that I wear, I should think about them as having been produced by girls in the global South to whom I am related by virtue of the fact that they have been exploited, their labor has been exploited for the purposes of allowing me to dress in the way that I do. So that kind of doesn't really tell you what's next, but it gives you a sense of the ways in which our issues are constantly evolving. And I don't know whether there will ever be a time when we will solve all of the social and political issues. I think instead what happens is that as we engage in analysis, as we engage in struggle, we become aware of other struggles, other issues. And that is an infinite process, I think. And that is what is so exciting about being an activist today. Thank you.
wide-ranging, thought-provoking talk, which fitted exactly with the themes that we have had this weekend, of migrant women, women at work, women in conflict, and the theme that we had this morning in the panel discussion this morning about women's bodies. I think the slogan of a radical, working-class, anti-racist, anti-colonialist, environmentalist feminism exactly sums up what the Whole Day Society and our international partners ELDH and IADL stand for and are struggling for. And so we're very honoured indeed to have Angela Davis explain some of the thought processes behind those slogans, and I'm sure she's inspired all of us to go out and struggle for a better world. Please join me once again in thanking Angela.